Welcome to Canadian Cannabis License Application Process, Good Production Practices Requirements, Part 1. My name is Abby, and I will be your narrator. So why do we need good production practices? Well, the Canadian regulations require licensed producers to follow good production practices to help ensure cannabis is produced in a consistent manner to meet quality standards appropriate to the intended use of the cannabis. This applies to cultivating, propagating, harvesting, producing, manufacturing, fabricating, synthesizing, or processing cannabis. Good production practices are required in order to produce, sell, distribute, or export cannabis. So good production practices have requirements for SOPs, just like good manufacturing practices also have requirements for SOPs. The difference is that good production practices are unique to the cannabis industry, while good manufacturing practices are generalized to all other industries. So the holders of a license for cultivation, processing, and sale of cannabis for medical purposes must meet the general requirements with respect to activities conducted with cannabis or anything that will be used as an ingredient in manufacturing or producing cannabis or cannabis products. Standard operating procedures are the backbone of operations: quality, consistency, traceability. It is important to have effective standard operating procedures in place if you want to have a successful company producing consistent, quality, traceable products. So in our series of slides and videos on how to write effective standard operating procedures, we have gone over what standard operating procedures are. This slide, when we talk about standard operating procedures, we are looking at why they are necessary. So standard operating procedures are used because, according to regulations, anything that will be used as an ingredient must be produced, packaged, labeled, distributed, stored, sampled, and tested in accordance with standard operating procedures. Standard operating procedures should include all steps necessary to be in compliance with good production practices so as to avoid adverse impacts on the quality of the cannabis. All manufacturing companies have key operational areas, key operational elements. So the standard operating procedure must cover those key operational areas and elements, and these include sanitation of building or part of a building and the equipment, employee hygiene, distribution, including transfer and receipt of cannabis and ingredients, production and processing of cannabis and ingredients, which include if you are cultivating or cloning, propagating cannabis, trimming, thinning, pruning, lollipopping, adding nutrients, fertilizers, pest control products, harvesting, drying, curing, burping, extracting, processing, encapsulating, and other discrete unit production, producing edible cannabis or an ingredient used in its making, sampling and testing of cannabis, packaging and labeling for bulk cannabis, samples, immediate containers, discrete units, storage for bulk cannabis ingredients, quarantined product, product on hold, product that's recalled, products that's approved for sale, product in transit, and product destined for destruction. It's important that your SOPs cover all these key operational elements and more. So you have your standard operating procedures that are covering your key operational areas or key operational elements. But you want to have principles and practices that demonstrate compliance with the cannabis regulations. as well. So what you'll do is put into effect, for example, quality assurance and quality risk management systems that would have SOPs to review procedures on a regular basis and revise them as needed. So, for example, if there is a deviation from an SOP, you would have in place this review procedure. And in this review procedure, you would have certain forms or documents that would capture the details of the deviation, such as the reason for and the anticipated nature of the deviation, so whether it's planned or unplanned. You would have information about meetings, perhaps that assessment of the GPP impacts were discussed, and you would have directives in there to compile a report in accordance with the SOP for handling and reporting the deviations. You would also have mandatory training of personnel on the new or revised SOP before the effective date of the SOP is assigned. So let's look at principles and practices that meet good production practices requirements for developing compliant SOPs. So one of those principles and or practice would be the reduction or elimination of the risk of contamination to the product. So let's look at a definition of sanitation, because sanitation is a required element in order to reduce the risk of contamination. And based on the regulation and guidance documents, this is the definition. A condition in which the risk of contamination, allergen cross-contamination, or introduction of an extraneous substance to the cannabis or anything that will be used as an ingredient in the production of cannabis or cannabis products is eliminated. So examples of areas for the element of sanitation would be building design. How is your building designed? Is it designed to allow traffic flow and product flow that avoids contamination? How about utilities? Are utilities installed and in such a way that the design allows for access and cleaning? And how is the heating and ventilation system? Does the building design allow for proper heating and ventilation? What about employees' health, hygiene, and safety? Well, we want to make sure that employees are well, as not ill. They are taking care of themselves personally, and they're conducting or performing hand washing and sanitization, and also gowning and personal protective equipment as needed. Visitors access and controls are in place to make sure that visitors are also washing their hands and gowning and reporting anything that they need to report. Pest control, that pesticides are being used that are approved, and there's environmental monitoring happening around that. Also, in terms of controlling pests mechanically or electronically, that there are procedures in place to capture and remove pests, and also waste disposal to make sure that cannabis byproducts as well as general refuse and pests that have been eliminated or destroyed somehow can be removed in an appropriate way that does not allow for contamination of any products. Then equipment are used in a way that they're designed for, and that all the surfaces can be cleaned and sanitized. Room, so would have paint that are food grade that can be cleaned and sanitized, for example. Validation of the procedures are in place and methods that will analyze how those procedures are validated. Processes would indicate that employees are well trained on processes before the effective date is assigned to the SOP. And then there's sampling and testing on all bulk and finished products. There are other examples of good production practices associated with other good variable practices. And I say variable because this is called GXP. You can insert where the variable X is pretty much any type of practice. So in this case, good documentation practices that is compliant to the good production practices or associated with that would replace like a GXP. And in this example of good production practices, you would be looking at the types of documentation that you need to have in place. So your protocols, your batch and batch reports and change control documents, maybe even some of your administrative documents. But what's important is when you're designing these SOPs, you want to involve the SOP user. You want to make sure that, for example, your production SOPs that you are having documentation practices for, involve the SOP users because they know what's going on. They're the ones who have to do the actual performing of the SOPs. Print the names of approving individuals, include signatures and approval dates, number sections, paragraphs, and pages. Use text that is clear, simple, and concise, and include charts. Have procedures for correcting errors. Here is an example of practices and principles that help your SOP to be compliant with good production practices requirements. This example is on retention of documents and information. So under distribution, you would have documented all related processes, activities, and information regarding the sale, distribution, and export of cannabis. And for each lot or batch of cannabis where any portion was sold or exported, you will retain records that demonstrate that all the ingredients used were produced, packaged, labeled, distributed, stored, sampled, and tested as per regulatory requirements and applicable guidance. This will allow traceability. You also want to retain these documents for at least 2 years after the day on which they were prepared, or retain records 2 years after the day the last sale or export of any portion of the lot or the batch occurred. We've reached the end of this video. We want to encourage you to look at the next video, which will be based on GPPs for cultivation and propagation. And we would look at the key operational elements and give a couple of examples of standard operating procedures for cultivation and propagation. Finally, if you enjoy viewing our videos and would like to see more content, please support us by liking. If you wish to be notified about new content, then subscribe and click the bell button to receive notifications. Thank you for watching.